Before I start my formal introduction, and after just riding the train through Brussels last week, I felt the need to say something and to take a moment to refer to a letter Kollwitz wrote in 1944. After living in Berlin during 2 world wars, she pondered that future generations would not understand her time. Unfortunately, with attacks like the one that just happened in Brussels this morning becoming an almost weekly event, and men like Trump gaining momentum, my personal fear is that our generation is prone to understanding Kollwitz's time better and better. However, let's hope with Kollwitz, who even until the very end of her life retained a firm belief in the ultimate higher development of mankind, a belief which he defended against all evidence on the contrary. Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy you could make it to tonight's lecture with the intriguing title, Käthe Kollwitz and the Polarity of Beauty, Nietzsche or the Silesian Angel. My name is Henriette Ketzevries. I'm the manager of the Cunningham Center for Prints, Drawings, and Photographs at the Smith College Museum of Art. And I'm also the curator of the Kollwitz exhibition, Mother's Arms, Käthe Kollwitz, Women and War. And I have the honor today to introduce Professor Joseph McVeigh. When I met Professor McVeigh about 2 years ago, after having contacted him in connection to his collection of German propaganda materials, which I had seen, or at least some of it, in his Nielsen Library exhibition From Weimar to War, which he curated in 2009, I immediately knew I wanted to work with him. Personally, I was still slightly traumatized by my eccentric nihilist German teacher from my high school days in Holland, who forced me to read German novels way above my capacity. So I was very glad to find instead a warm and incredibly knowledgeable man who was happy to assist me in every way he could, and he did. From that moment on, Professor McVeigh became a constant help and resource for the Kollwitz exhibition I was working on, either by the generous loans from his collection, which are now displayed in the large case in the exhibition, or by consulting me on all things German. From that day forward, I also happily received invitations to the seasonal German department festivities, and I'll forgive him the fact that there was no beer at the Oktoberfest. So when planning the Kollwitz catalog, Professor McVeigh became an obvious choice as a contributing essayist, a task he embraced wholeheartedly while in the midst of other major projects. But of course, he even managed to be the first to finish his essay, which in retrospect did not surprise me at all. And the catalog, I have to show it here, a co-production between Wellesley College and Smith, presents essays by faculty and curators from both institutions, and is by the way for sale in our museum store and also available online. I come from a Dutch mercantile family, so I had to give the catalog a plug. So this is it. It's beautiful, by the way. Professor McVeigh's other publications are too many to name, but they vary from translating 300-year-old esoteric German texts to a book based on never-before-unearthed footage of the beloved post-war Viennese poet Ingeborg Bachmann, and in the process he managed to stir up some controversy in Austria. Professor McVeigh received his PhD in German in 1984 from the University of Pennsylvania and came to Smith in the fall of 1985. His research interests lie primarily in post-1945 Austrian and German literary culture and in the area of Austrian and American cultural relations. But as his many publications attest to, this area seems to be ever expanding. As he said in an interview to our own Sophian student-run newspaper, as in life itself, one never knows where one's interest and research will lead. Well, tonight his interest and research led him here to talk to us about Käthe Kollwitz and to address the many different cultural influences in her life, from Friedrich Nietzsche to the 17th century mystic Angelus Silesius, the Silesian Angel, a subject I'm personally incredibly curious about. So I'm very honored and glad he was able to make time for us during his well-deserved sabbatical. We therefore welcome Professor Joseph McVeigh.
Wow, thank you, Henriette. Well, welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be part of the Käthe Kollwitz exhibition through this lecture and through the article I contributed for the catalog. Excuse me, I'm starting to get a cold, so I apologize in advance if I turn and cough. While I'm not an art historian, as you'll soon hear, I am, by my professional predilection, a cultural historian. And as such, in looking at Käthe Kollwitz, I found her to be intriguing and fascinating, not just in her art, everyone knows her art, but as a writer. Her diaries and her letters are fascinating documents. As Henriette pointed out, there's stuff in there that people are always surprised about. So while I was researching the article for the catalog, I was struck by a certain tension or polarity that repeatedly comes to the fore in her diary and in her letters. She expresses it in a number of different ways, sometimes as a dichotomy between the inner world of the mind and the outer world of daily life, or it could be perhaps a struggle to make sense of her religious upbringing in the material world, or at other times, in a more practical sense, as a tension between what she wants to achieve as an artist and what she thinks she can actually achieve. In trying to make sense of these forces tugging at her in both her personal and professional life, two names in particular stand out in her writings as representatives of a kind of a polarity in its most general sense. And they are the two gentlemen portrayed up here, flanking her on the screen, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, otherwise known as the philosopher whose name many people can't spell correctly, and the 17th century, not really well-known mystical religious poet Johann Scheffler, who's better known by his nom de plume, Angelus Silesius, the Silesian Angel. Silesia was previously part of Germany, the eastern areas of Germany. It's now part of Poland. We will get to these two figures in due course tonight, but we want to first take a closer look at the question of who she was, both in her public image as well as in her own image of herself, her self-identity. Kollwitz's image in both popular and scholarly publications is typically that of the social activist and socialist stalwart who starkly and powerfully portrays the situation of the poor, the oppressed, and the suffering. She was also an artist who sought to use her art to fulfill what she calls, quote, my burden to be an advocate for them. Whoops. This image was reinforced famously by the French writer Romain Rolland and his description of Kollwitz in 1927 as the voice of the silence of the sacrificed people. La voix du silence des peuples sacrifiés. And by the artist's own oft-repeated statement, ich will wirken in dieser Zeit. I want to have an effect in this time, in the present. That is, without question, an accurate portrayal of the work she produced. However, any number of statements and positions taken by the artist in her writings do not mesh entirely well with this image. She writes in her diary, for example, that she drew figures from the working class primarily because they were more aesthetically interesting than the middle class. Quote, the real reason why I chose almost exclusively to portray the life of workers was because the motifs that I selected from this sphere of life provided me with something that I perceived to be beautiful. And when she was described by some contemporaries as an artist who depicts only misery, she responded that what she portrays was motivated not so much by societal circumstances, soziale Nöte, she writes, but rather by life itself that confronts us all with such suffering. That her cycles of drawings on the Weavers' Rebellion of 1844 and the peasant uprising of the 1520s are her most famous creations, both were created before 1910, reinforced her image as a revolutionary of sorts, and perhaps even a communist at heart, some suspect, since she made a powerful woodcut of workers sorrowfully viewing the corpse of Karl Liebknecht, one of the founders of the German Communist Party, who was assassinated in 1919. Certainly, in her youth, she indulged in such feelings, as she writes in her diary. But as she notes, as early as 1912, she was moving away from such representations of societal discord. Then again later, in 1921, she writes that she no longer harbored the, quote, illusions of her youthful revolutionary period that produced these works, not least because she had now witnessed the horrors of the revolution in Berlin in 1919 and no longer supported this path to change. She noted later that her woodcut of Liebknecht and the people mourning him was a request by the family, and she writes in October of 1920, "I have the right to draw the dead Liebknecht without following him politically, don't I?" These and many other statements she made in her diaries and letters seem to indicate that there was something more at work here as a motivating factor than just political ideology or aesthetics. A letter from April of 1917 is telling in this regard. Here, she summarizes her political philosophy by praising the social democrats in Russia. The October Revolution wouldn't take place for a few more months, because they speak the language of internationalism, we would say today globalism, but also they love their country and try to preserve das Völkische, that is, the traditions, customs, and culture of their people. Hoping to see a similar development in Germany, she writes, "We have to find a way to preserve the unique culture of our people while preventing the nationalist competition that led to war." It is not a coincidence, then, that her political philosophy mentions the national culture, since this element played a prominent role throughout her reflections on her work and her life. Indeed, from the importance that she attributes to cultural references in her writings, it would appear that Käthe Kollwitz was, simply put, a Bildungsbürger, for whom the high cultural canon of German music, literature, and art was an indispensable reservoir of guidance and wisdom on how to view the world and how to conduct one's life. So, what then is a Bildungsbürger, you ask? Well, thank you for asking. First and foremost, it is a societal class that cultivated a way of life primarily centered around high culture, music, literature, and art. It was primarily, but not exclusively, a phenomenon of the middle classes in Germany that enjoyed its heyday during Käthe Kollwitz's lifetime, at least before 1933. The first half of the word Bildung denotes education, but more importantly, formation, while the latter half, the word Bürger, means essentially citizen, but also can mean middle class. It's come to mean middle class, as in the French bourgeoisie. Originating in the period of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, the class of the Bildungsbürger shared a strong belief in reason, culture, and education, as well as in the application of these things for the common good, typically through government and institutional service. In the 18th and early 19th century, this group was typically composed of academics, intellectuals, artists, and writers. Inherent in the evolving definition of the term Bildungsbürger was also an emphasis on personal development and accomplishment, since education and enlightenment should, it was believed, lead to that. By 1867, when Käthe Kollwitz is born, and the Industrial Revolution in Germany was in full swing, these earlier groups were joined by successful business people, engineers, industrialists, journalists, and scientists in exercising a growing influence in shaping public policy and public opinion. Although Kollwitz grew up in a staunchly socialist family, the family was also staunchly middle class and focused on education, both worldly and spiritual. Her father, Karl Schmidt, was a successful stonemason and home builder in East Prussia who could afford to pay for her art lessons and send her to Munich to continue her studies. He studied law himself, but had to give up his dream of pursuing a career in this area because he was also a preacher in the Free Evangelical Lutheran community, a breakaway branch of the Lutheran Church in Germany, which was headed by his father-in-law, Julius Rupp. After 1890, when the so-called socialist laws in Germany, which forbade organized socialist groups, had lapsed and the Socialist Workers' Party became a legal political party, the democratic branch of socialism soon became the largest faction in the German Reichstag, the parliament. Socialism was moving into the political and societal mainstream in Germany, even if it was still viewed with suspicion in many circles as a potential source of revolution. This move into the mainstream was solidified by the ultimate support of the socialists in the Reichstag, the parliament, for Germany's war effort in World War I. But this position was not without its inherent contradictions, as exemplified by a socialist youth rally held in October 1913, less than 1 year before the guns of August commenced firing. At the rally, I'm sorry that the quality of this photo is so poor, but it's one of the few that exists of this. At the rally, attended by Käthe Kollwitz's youngest son Peter, as well as his friends, the closing speaker, a friend of the family, the educational reformer Gustav Wyneken, spoke against the gathering clouds of war by invoking the words of the philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte from the early 1800s that were penned during the War of Liberation against Napoleon some 100 years earlier. Quote, "Save yourself, Germany, for the world needs you. Save this nation as the finest and sharpest weapon of the world spirit." The world spirit. The reference here is to a concept from the philosopher, I love these German names, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. That's why people just call him Hegel shortly. Whereby someone or something embodies in each historical period the destiny of that period, or the world spirit. Hegel famously said, "Oh, that's Napoleon. We're seeing in this picture the world spirit on horseback." That is Napoleon he cited as an example of what he means by the destiny of the time. It was Napoleon's destiny to do what he did and to reshape Europe. Certainly, there were some concrete grounds for making the hyperbolic claim at that time that Germany embodied the progress of the world spirit through history. Among these reasons was the preeminent position of German scientists in a number of fields. For example, from the founding of the Nobel Prize in 1901 to the end of World War I, Germans were awarded 7 prizes in chemistry, 6 in physics, and 4 in medicine, as well as 4 of the first 12 Nobel Prizes in literature. At this time, American higher education was already implementing the German university model at its institutions of higher learning. This message of a cultural superiority, echoed by the socialist speakers at this rally, was in many ways not much different from that given at nationalist rallies of the time that also portrayed Germany as the finest embodiment of the world spirit, thus justifying this country's leadership in Europe, if not the entire world. Regardless of which side of the political divide in Germany one found oneself at that time, the appeal to culture for political purposes resonated quite powerfully, not least because culture had been the most powerful unifying element in German-speaking Europe prior to the political unification in 1871. This cultural patriotism of the decades before World War I easily transitioned to a political patriotism that touted German cultural preeminence as a reason to justify the war. These are a couple of monuments that were built after political unification. There was a new national mythology that was created and captured in the many monuments built at that time. And they included not only political monuments, the one on the left is a big monument that deals with the legend of Emperor Barbarossa. Friedrich Barbarossa from the Middle Ages would return one day to unite Germany. Well, Germany's united, so let's build him a monument. The other, this fellow with the sword, is Arminius, has also been called Hermann the German because Hermann was another one of his names in the mythology. And he defeated 2 Roman legions back in 9 AD. So these are heroes. There's a whole mythology being built up to show that the current time is the fulfillment of the world spirit that has been developing through the ages. So that's the political side of it, but there was also there was also a cultural side. And we see here some monuments to Goethe and Schiller, 2 of the most famous writers from the earlier part of the 19th century. And these are just some of the ones that were also built after political unification. So this appeal to culture was also very important in World War I for German propaganda. And a very famous or infamous appeal was made by and signed by 92 scientific and cultural luminaries in Germany and published in all sorts of venues, all sorts of media for German propaganda. This one, the heading up there, is a magazine in English published in New York City during the First World War, at least up until the time America joined the war in 1917. But the appeal is typical here. This appeal of the 92, the Manifesto of the 92 as it was called, was literally titled "To the Civilized World." And as you can read there, it says that we will fight this war as a civilized nation, basically. And they relate that to the legacy of Goethe. Beethoven and Kant, the philosopher Kant, is just as sacred as our concrete existence, our hearths and our homes. So this appeal of the 92, this manifesto of the 92, included a lot of people that Kollwitz had to do with. Max Klinger, one of her mentors, was one of the signees. The dramatist Gerhard Hauptmann, the person who inspired her Weaver's cycle. Several Nobel Prize winners, as well as the composer Engelbert Humperdinck. There's a real composer named Engelbert Humperdinck, in case you didn't know. And many, many, many other cultural luminaries. The Social Democrats, who now shared power in the Reichstag prior to World War I, were certainly not immune to various aspects of this nationalist perspective. And neither was Käthe Kollwitz. In 1911, for example, she gave her signature to a statement of protest by German artists, organized by the artist Karl Winnen, against modernist trends coming from France and for more national, that is German, art in German museums. A few months later, she writes, "I regret that I ever signed that thing. It was only because I was upset because I don't like Matisse." She's terribly honest in these things. So, her reticence to condemn the First World War at first, that her son Peter so passionately defended, is a position that she calls, quote, her indefensibly contradictory view of war. And this was very much in keeping with the general enthusiasm for the war in Germany at that time, prior to 1914. But this was also something she came to regret after Peter's death. Nevertheless, even after the war, she is still moved by patriotic feelings aroused by Germany's dire circumstances after 1918. And she expresses her hope for better times for the nation by citing a patriotic poem. It's a poem called Bekenntnis. I just translated it here as acknowledgement because it's acknowledging our love. You can read it there. We've long acknowledged our love for you, but never called it by name. When we were called, we answered with joy, with one word not spoken, but in our hearts, Germany. So she puts this in one of her diary entries when she's talking about, I still feel this way about the country. I feel terrible for what's happening here. This poem was written in December 1914 by a socialist union activist, the poet Karl Brügger. And it became so famous that the chancellor of the time, on the right-hand side, Theobald Bethmann-Hollweg, read it in German parliament as an example of how all of Germany was united in the war effort and its love for the homeland. To a certain degree, Kollwitz experienced in her life a development or evolution similar to the one that German socialism underwent from the 19th to the 20th century, moving from her revolutionary period during the 1890s and early 1900s, when she produced The Weavers and the Peasant Rebellion, to a more practical commitment to more contemporary social issues, as seen in her posters of the 20s. Obviously, the one on the top left, very famous, anti-war. The one on the right-hand side, against laws forbidding abortion. And the one at the bottom was, what's the word we use? We use prohibition in the US, but it's against alcohol abuse and things of that sort. So while she is producing these political posters, however, she is also focusing on existential themes, such as her drawings around the theme of death, for which she completes a series of 8 drawings in 1923 with the title Departure and Death, Abschied und Tod. Such existential themes recur in her written reflections after 1914, become increasingly tied to a desire to transcend the misery and sadness of the present. Thus, it is no surprise, perhaps, that when describing her political philosophy in a letter to her son Hans that we referred to previously, she uses religious imagery to express her confidence that humankind will progress, despite the setbacks of the war. Quote, "It looks to me as if a new creation is revealing itself from behind all these trials that the world is currently undergoing. And the blood of millions that has been shed has flowed so that humanity can be raised up higher than it was before. This is my way of politicizing, my son, and it all comes down to faith." 1 year later, end of the quote. 1 year later, at a celebration of the end of the war, she identifies the cultural basis of her identification with democratic socialism by citing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, in particular the text of poet Friedrich Schiller's Ode to Joy, familiar to most, if not all of us. Sung in the final choral movement of the symphony, she writes, "The Ninth Symphony contains socialism in its purest form, a divine celebration of existence, and how can I explain the feeling that came over me when the chorus sang, 'O world, can you sense the presence of the Creator?'" End of quote. Käthe Kollwitz never gave up this idealistic view of socialism and human progress. Indeed, if there was one feature that distinguished German Enlightenment from that of England and France, it is such idealism tied to culture. While Locke and Hume, Voltaire and Montesquieu were concerned with the application of reason to society, the German Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant was pondering the question of how we can be sure that we know what we know. Epistemology, you gotta love it. Such idealism is evident everywhere in Kollwitz's writings, including in her reflections on the death of her son, when she ponders what it meant for him to have died for an idea. That idea being Germany is what he identified to her as the idea for which he fought. Despite her political activism, Kollwitz's cultural tastes were surprisingly, by and large quite traditional, as is evident from the list of authors and composers, both classical and contemporary, that populate her writings. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Gottfried Keller, Friedrich von Hardenberg, Franz Grillparzer, Hugo von Hofmannsthal, Agnes Miegel, Johann Sebastian Bach, Ludwig van Beethoven. I could go on and on and on. She has dozens and dozens of names that she cites and takes very seriously. I didn't put pictures up for all these people because it would take too many slides. Her canon does include a number of firebrands of the time, such as her contemporaries Gerhard Hauptmann, who influenced her Weaver's cycle, Frank Wedekind, from the turn of the 20th century, or the 19th century German writer Heinrich Heine. But they too were largely part or becoming part of the mainstream by the end of World War I. Her acceptance of the conventional cultural canon extends to her artistic tastes as well. In a number of diary entries and letters, she repeatedly expresses her great admiration for Renaissance art. With regard to contemporary modernist trends, however, she was somewhat more reserved. Beginning in 1912, she takes note of some of the new trends in art, and although she is genuinely open to some, she likes, for example, the sculptures of Rodin and Ernst Barlach, among others. How could she not like that Barlach? And she herself is usually counted among the expressionists, but she has little time for the more experimental, abstract forms of modernism, although she does not name names in her diary, at least none that I could find. Reporting on an article she read in February of 1916 about expressionism by the writer Eduard von Keyserling, she agrees with his conclusion that when the debilitating war ends, the German people will need an art that is based on realistic representations, Wirklichkeitskunst, rather than on what she calls eccentric studio art, verstiegene Atelierskunst. 1 year later, in November 1917, she writes that the art of the modern era is terribly barren, because it no longer contains a secret or something hidden from the first look, as one might find in classical or Renaissance art. She admits in her typically self-deprecating manner that even her own art itself up to that point contained no secret to be uncovered by the observer, and she ends by exclaiming, what kind of work was I only too willing to accept earlier? Long before her admission to the Prussian Academy of Arts in 1919, she had already arrived as an artist and as a person of respect. She notes this in her diary entry of March of 1916. She had arrived quite early, in the early teens of the 20th century. By 1926, people knew her because of exhibitions, the famous ones where the Kaiser said, "You're not going to get a gold medal because I don't like what you did." But she exhibited her work, and her work was becoming very well known. By 1926, however, and for me this was telling, she makes it into the cigarette picture album, The World in Pictures, that has a page on all sorts of different, not connected things. And this one is Important Women. Now, what makes this so impressive, I think, for her fame, is that this book wasn't made for the Bildungsbürger. This book was made for the working class. People collected these pictures from cigarette packs, and they put them into albums. And this is a who's who in the eyes of all these cigarette companies that got together and put out approximately 1 million copies of this in a country of 60 million, I think, at the time. There's Käthe Kollwitz. Alice Solomon next to her is involved in women's rights. Ricarda Huch is all the way on the left, is a famous writer, but a very conservative writer. And down below, Mary Wigman, bottom right. Luders, who is involved in politics in some respect. I must confess I can't remember what that says under her name. And Michaelis, another writer, Karin Michaelis. In any case, she's the only artist there, the only visual art person. And if you want to say, well, she's famous, sure, she was very famous among people who knew art very well. She's also famous to everybody. So, at least anyone who smokes. She was also part, because she arrived, of the social elite of the time, attending the occasional literary soiree and other events of that sort. And she was a member of the highly exclusive Lyceum Women's Club in Berlin, founded in 1905, based on the model of British men's clubs. This club only accepted members who were highly accomplished in literature, journalism, science, business, and the fine and applied arts. Its members included a who's who of the women's movement at the time in Germany. There's just some names there. There's Alice Solomon again, who had made that cigarette album. And these are just a few. There are many, many more. Women artists like Kollwitz would, however, not be accepted into the club if their works had only been shown at exhibition of women artists. Found that interesting. A restriction that she herself appeared to find reasonable. For when serving on a jury judging the work of women artists in January of 1916, she notes in her diary, "I'm in an unpleasant position on this jury. I'm supposed to represent the woman's point of view, something that I cannot do with any conviction." End of quote. Her own work, however, passed the stringent muster for membership in the Lyceum Club, and she was made a member. However, all of these trappings of middle-class cultural identity and social elite standing would be little more than elegant accessories of her public life, were it not for the fact that she was deeply affected by the literature, music, and art that she consumed. In her approach to self-discovery, self-criticism, and self-improvement, she drew advice or examples from many of the books and articles that she read. Whereas today that might mean any of the best-selling gurus of self-improvement, for Kollwitz it was Goethe and a whole panoply of other 18th and 19th century German poets and thinkers. So, what import then did this intense interest in the cultural canon have for her work and her personal development? To answer this question, we should return to consideration of the two gentlemen mentioned in the title of the lecture, Friedrich Nietzsche and Angelus Silesius. At first glance, these two thinkers might appear to be unreconcilably different in their message. Nietzsche, who saw Christianity as propagating a, quote, slave morality, anathema to the free exercise of the individual's will, and Silesius, who preached the very morality that Nietzsche abjured. But as with any claim of influence, it is Kollwitz's interpretation of the ideas of both men that is most important here, and not how accurately she did or did not capture their thinking. She herself did not see them as contradictory in their respective messages on self-development, but rather complementary. Let me explain. When she does mention Nietzsche in her writings, it is in conjunction with reflections on what she wants from life and from her art, and how she can best find meaning in both. These questions are part of a larger process of introspection that she undertook after the death of her son Peter, that attempts to understand the teachings of her grandfather, Julius Rupp, summarized in the inscription on his gravestone, quote, "Man is not born to be happy, but to fulfill his duty," end quote. In a diary entry of September 1915, she asked the question, what is the goal of humankind? In her answer, she posits three types of happiness in ascending order. First, common happiness, falling in love, being in good health, having enough to eat, etc. Second, the happiness of self-improvement, in which all of one's inherent abilities are being cultivated, actively pursued. And third, the highest level, that she calls becoming one with God, is where these abilities come to full fruition. She goes on to elaborate that the second level, when done correctly, leads to the development of the third level that includes the concept of das Geistige. And I think there it is. Within each person, that is a higher element that could be translated here as either intellectual or spiritual, but something of the mind, of the spirit. This highest level of individual happiness can then be reflected in the culture as a whole, if everyone strives to fulfill his or her duty and to develop their capacities to the greatest extent. If this happens, echtes Wesen, the second part there, or genuineness results, and, quote, the culture of a people can, in the end, not be successfully built on anything else. So how does this reflection from 1915 lead her to Nietzsche? Well, in a seminal text in this regard, a seminal text in this regard is a long diary entry dated February 1917. Here she begins by remarking that she has been reading Tolstoy's diary and finds his concept of a life in Christ quite strange, conceding that it sounds a lot like what her grandfather taught in his religion classes for children, which she says she didn't really pay attention to and didn't get much from. Asking herself why she finds this religious concept of self-denial so estranging, she comes to the conclusion that the question of who she is can only be answered in what she calls the Nietzschean sense. That is, quote, I want to be free from everything that hinders or limits my true self. She goes on to ask who this true self is and concludes, quote, it's not me as a Christian, but it's me, Käthe Kollwitz, end quote. She then identifies what she sees as Nietzsche's prescription for finding one's true self. One must, quote, thoroughly weed out what is random, dumb, and evil in oneself and strengthen that which is of value. This does indeed sound like Nietzsche's prescription for radical individualism. However, just when the reader thinks, aha, now she can be understood as a Nietzschean and understanding his concept of the will to power, she suddenly concludes her remarks with a quote from Angelus Silesius. In fact, with his most famous line, the pithy and enigmatic Mensch werde wesentlich. Translated, man, become essential. Become your essence, if you will. Good Bildungsbürger that she is, however, she does not let things rest with references to Tolstoy, Nietzsche, and Silesius, all in the same text, but she extends her prescription for self-realization to the development of all mankind and cites Gotthold Ephraim Lessing's essay on the education of the human race from 1780. Lessing is also the author of Nathan the Wise, if you're familiar with that play, and there's a ring parable in there that is sort of the dramatic version of this essay on the education of the human race. This quintessential document of German Enlightenment thinking sees mankind developing in 3 steps towards a community of all people based on reason and doing good, not for fear of punishment or for a promise of reward, but for its own sake, because it is right to do so. In a letter from the spring of 1922, she amplifies this position by noting that for years her view on morality was also shaped in part by the thinking of the Jewish poet Heinrich Heine, whose poem Seraphine in 1844 echoes Lessing's 3 steps of mankind's development. The quote here, this is from the poem by Heine in translation. Here on this stone, let us build a church of the third New Testament. The time of sorrow has passed, end of quote. Here we once again find the optimism she expressed in her letter to her son Hans about her political philosophy that we mentioned earlier. The reason her reflection on Nietzsche's prescription for self-development ends with a nod to a 17th century religious poet is essentially because Nietzsche states what should be rooted out of one's character and leaves somewhat vague what should fill the gap, calling it only something worthwhile. Silesius emphasizes what should replace it, that spark of divinity that resides in every human being that he calls the essential, which for Kollwitz is essentially das Geistige. This was a crucial insight for Kollwitz, for she interprets it as a call to duty, or in her case, a call to achieve the best she can in her work. Perhaps that is why she mentions Nietzsche by name only 3 times, whereas Silesius's poems are quoted at length time and again, and his central concept of the essential repeatedly recurs in her writings during this period. One entry in her diary from 1919 consists simply of a 4-line aphorism by Silesius. And it reads, in translation, whoever does not push themselves to be the child of the Most High will find his place in the stable, among the animals and stable hands. If we think back to the 3 stages of development, self-development, with the last being the full fruition of the godly spark, it becomes clear that the first line of this text is the central thought for her, namely that one must be ambitious in developing this spark, whoever does not push oneself to be. But it also represents her belief that culture is the medium for higher things, in particular music and literature. She writes in one diary entry, divine revelation, higher things, this is all contained only in music and literature. And then you can almost picture her going, wait a minute. And then she says a little bit later, oh yes, yeah, and in some art too, some art, yeah. There's some art too where you find that stuff. But what art does she cite? She cites Renaissance art and classical Greek art, things of that sort. I find it fascinating that someone in the visual arts would write, as she does 1 year after this, leaving out art for higher things. She writes a year later, has any drawing or sculpture ever had the same effect on me as Goethe's Faust or Beethoven's Ninth Symphony? This is quite an interesting thought from a visual artist, wouldn't you say? In any event, to achieve the highest order of happiness, one must first confront one's shortcomings, the dumb, evil, and random aspects that Nietzsche singled out. Peter's death in 1914 was, in this regard, a watershed event, because she became increasingly aware of a tension within her between what she called the monster, that is, the brutally naked and crass side of life, whose violence, vehemence, and implacability make life almost unbearable. Between that and her efforts to subdue it, this tension. Is it any wonder then that she was so enamored of Goethe's Faust drama, to work in 2 parts, in which the hero is saved from his pact with the devil with the angelic proclamation at the end, quote, whoever strives with all his might, that man we can redeem. Confronting the monster, Kollwitz writes, takes her back to a period 20 years earlier. If we do the math, and this was from 1912, it was back to the time when she's first conceiving the Weavers, right about the time she's about to begin work on the Weavers. And she says she did not want to go back there again. The loss of her son, however, had sensitized her to this side of life, for the monster that took his life, the war, was little different from the one that took the lives of the rebelling Weavers. It was, whatever its motivation, crass and nakedly brutal. But the insight gained by her son's death also pointed her to the opposing and redeeming force, das Geistige, or the essential. After Peter's death, she reflected at length on whether there was a higher order beyond material existence, and if so, how one could identify it. In a diary entry from 1916, when she is contemplating the possibility that she might have received a sign from Peter, that is, she noticed a flower somewhere that she didn't expect it, and it was a flower that she had given him as he went off to war. She wonders if a person could be sensitized or sensitize themselves into a different reality. She mentions in this regard theosophy, an esoteric philosophy concerned with higher knowledge. She then gives a quote from Silesius, that the seeker who is aware of the divine spark within will find what they seek, something that gives her hope that she will be united again with Peter one day if she fulfills her duty and does her creative work. Yet, in relating this in her diary, such a reuniting is viewed not in religious terms, but in those of familiar cultural paradigms. She asks her son Hans in a letter if he believes they will see Peter again. I'm sorry, she doesn't write to Hans, but she's in a diary entry, I believe it is. She asks Hans if he believes they'll see Peter again, and he answers, well, yeah, of course, just like Faust is reunited with Gretchen at the end. And Gretchen is the young woman in the Faust story that Faust seduces and abandons in the first part, and to which Kollwitz had previously given visual form 1898, she draws a Gretchen. And if you don't know Faust, the reference would not be clear necessarily. But the audience, the educated Bildungsbürger, would know immediately what that reference is to. Silesius accompanies her throughout this introspective period in her writings, perhaps in part because he speaks to a dimension of self-realization that occupied most of her adult life. And after Peter's death, she is much more open about exploring matters of her inner life, even studying the Bible in depth, although she notes this was not the case in earlier years, when she was more inclined to reject any non-materialist view of things. Regardless of whether one was religiously inclined or not, it was an intrinsic part of a complete education for a Bildungsbürger to be, the German word is Bibelfest, means you are secure in your knowledge of Scripture, Old Testament, New Testament, whatever. And she certainly was, often singling out passages that resonated with her. One in particular that she found interesting speaks to her ethic of self-fulfillment. She cites the book of Revelation, chapter 3, verse 16, quote, "So, because you are lukewarm and neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth." She does not find this verse threatening, as many would, but instead rather comforting, since her approach to her life and work also stressed commitment, high energy, and persistence. Of the many names of writers, artists, composers, philosophers that she discusses in her writings, none are mentioned more frequently than the author of her beloved Faust, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. She considers him a kindred spirit. He is the quintessential Bildungsbürger, having made a name for himself in many areas of endeavor, among them literature, of course, but also science and public service, among others. His life and work embodies for Kollwitz the best of German culture and the synthesis of the ideas she found so seminal in Nietzsche and Silesius. She senses her artistic energies beginning to ebb in the 1920s and turns for solace to the writings of the older Goethe, who was productive well into his 80s. He could do this, she notes, because he rid himself of all extraneous distractions and was determined, quote, determined, strong, and extremely concentrated on his work. In other words, he was focused on the essential, das Wesentliche, something she hoped to emulate. She's particularly impressed with his view that there would be a continued existence after this life for those whose earthly level of activity warranted it. She's writing this in 1923. While she's doing these political posters, she has this totally different side in her diary where she's reflecting on, where will I go after I die? My belief, the quote here, my belief in a continued existence, this is a quote from Goethe, she quotes Goethe. My belief in a continued existence arises out of the concept of activity. For if I am restlessly active right up to my end, then nature is obliged to provide me with another form of existence, once my spirit is no longer able to bear the present one. End of quote. Although she too wants to keep creatively active, she realizes that she is not like Goethe in one very significant way. Quote, what strikes me about Goethe's life is his attempt to learn about everything and to have an opinion about everything. This path I reject. I prefer limiting myself to those things I truly want to work on. This is in 1917, she writes that. Some 17 years later, in 1934, she again cites Goethe in expressing her hope that in her older years, in her later years, she could still come up with new, quote, ideas previously unthinkable. It's a quote from a reflection of Goethe's. One such idea, which was part of this burden that I carried, that we cited earlier, is her desire to create the image of one person who sees in their face the entire suffering, the suffering of the entire world, is the way she expressed it. And she asks, can that not be somebody other than Jesus? Can't I create a character, a human being that incorporates the suffering of the whole world? Perhaps she achieved this goal with her Pietà sculpture, whose mother figure she describes as, quote, an old, lonely, and darkly reflective woman who has taken on the suffering of her son, who was not accepted by mankind, she writes. Like the mother in the Pietà, who no longer, quote, no longer feels pain but only ponders, Kollwitz showed great equanimity in the face of her own rejection by the Nazi regime and expresses her, quote, ideas, previously unthinkable, end quote, in the iconography of her cultural heritage. Her production may have slowed in her later years. She writes in 1937 that her work is at an end. But her desire to create and express what she held to be essential did not flag and could not be divorced from those images, names, and ideas that underlie and inform her identity. Certainly, one does not need to have read Nietzsche, Silesius, or Goethe, or the countless other writers that inform her work and her values in order to appreciate what she accomplished. But like chicken soup, it couldn't hurt. For the simple human cry for compassion that underlies her work, although timeless and common throughout humankind, grew, in her case, out of a specific cultural tradition that produced many great works of Western culture and still impact it today. It was this synergy of cultural tradition and individual creativity that, quote, stimulates, rejuvenates, excites, and satisfies me, as she writes in 1912. That such a tradition could not prevent what followed toward the end of her life, that is, the political upheavals and horrors of the 30s and 40s, is still worthy of reflection today. But Käthe Kollwitz herself was able to withstand with dignity the corruption of the culture she so loved. And in doing so, she showed that she had, as Nietzsche had admonished, weeded out the dumb, evil, and random aspects of our nature, and successfully identified, as Silesius encourages his readers to do, the essential elements of human existence, which were for her love, compassion, and commitment, values that speak through generations and that make her exhibition here at Smith so timely. Thank you.